I think I learned or experienced three things. One was I learned and practiced by instinct, by example, probably from people like Jack Can, Steve Parliament, about organizing at the grassroots level and the importance of it, the validity of it. It was is the foundation of a democracy. So it was the life of a grassroots organizer that we lived, and it's important also that we lived in that community. We were not external organizers. We did not come from a school of organizing, which was very popular in that era, the Soloninsky industrial area training was offered to many of us that were active in around the country at that time. So that was really key to me, that I learned that being part of the community, organizing in the community that I was a member of, and that I was personally reacting to my own self-interest, my own observation of either injustice or things I didn't like that were happening in my community. And so the motivation came from my own heart. And so this idea of grassroots organizing as being central to building a democracy informed my United Nations work very much. I was active in the development field. So when proposals would come or be developed with governments, which was our partnership, how governments would empower grassroots communities through social development was very important to me. That was my litmus test. And it came from my heart. It came from the work on the West Bank. The second thing that I learned was leadership. And I was a very young person. I was in my 20s. And I observed people who were natural leaders. I was young, and I remember asking people, is it okay if I talk at the meeting? Which is quite incredible when you meet me today. But that was actually my where I started out. And can I make an observation at a meeting? Can I raise my hand? And so that community empowered me, and it also trained me organically by practice. And one of the things that happened in the organizing on the West Bank, which was parallel to the Red Barn and the organizing on the university campus around Dinkytown, where actually I grew up, was a man named Dean Zimmerman, who's quite well known in Minneapolis, came to our house and asked Steve Parliament and I or he called us actually, if we could come back to town. We were out of town at that time because there was an uprising in the neighborhood around the announcement of basically a clearance demolition of our entire neighborhood. And posters were put around the neighborhood by Dean and other people. I'm sure they were handwritten posters, mimeographed or maybe just handwritten a lot of times and tacked on telephone poles. 400 people and the press came to that meeting, and Dean Zimmerman and I chaired that meeting. We had only maybe a couple of questions to ask, and that was, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? And the community told us what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And we continued with that perspective that it would come from the heart of the community. The second thing that I learned in retrospect of the experience, as I started looking at other community organizing around the country and even maybe around the world, was that we were not asking for concessions or adjustments in a plan, like instead of 4th Street, take 3rd Street. Instead of 20-story tower, how about a 10-floor tower? And will you hire minority construction workers? I and a friend went to New York Chinatown, which was one of the first times that I'd been in New York Chinatown, and because there was a huge organizing effort there with 20,000 people on the street, and we wanted to know what happened. They had wonderful graphics, and we learned 2 things. One, that graphics were important, and having good communications was extremely important. But the thing that they asked for was diversity in construction jobs. So they were really penetrating the construction union, which was really, really important. But we came back thinking, that's not what we want. We want to own the land. We don't want jobs on this construction site for 10 people, which was what they got in Chinatown for 20,000 people on the street. We want to own the land, we want to own the buildings, and we want to run the buildings collectively with community input and community control. So we were looking for what we called an alternative institution building. And we called the People Center, which I and a number of other wonderful people founded together, was we wanted to build an alternative counter institution, that it would be structured differently, there would be different decision making, and the needs of the constituency, the needs of the patients or the needs of the community, whichever it was, would drive the policies. And I think that was really a very important lesson for any community organizing, is that you can ask for concessions along the way and you can get them or not get them. But if you do not own the capital or the actual product that you are protesting against, it won't make any difference. And in Chinatown today, they are organizing to form a community trust to capture the land that now is being gentrified by people who now see an opportunity to sell or whatever their motivations are. And the only way Chinatown in New York will be saved today, and I support an organization that's doing that now, of organizers, is to form a community land trust. So that experience on the West Bank informed my diplomatic career of what makes a difference, and that the organizing and the collective action of grassroots people really makes a difference. So, one can extrapolate that the community of nations makes a difference, and that not being the most powerful nation in the world gives you any more votes in the United Nations than a small nation with only a few thousand people. And I went to represent the United Nations on a number of small island states in the South Pacific, and also in Singapore and Malaysia, which are all obviously very different. But this lesson and heartfelt growth that I had on the West Bank in Cedar Riverside really made me represent the United Nations, I feel, in a different way, and motivated by a real experience in true democracy and true nation building, which I think that's what was happening on the West Bank. And when I go back there today, having left Minnesota and the United States for decades, I came back maybe 10, 15 years ago and saw the transformation of the community. And I looked at it and I said, this is our gift, that we organized this community and we were going to hand it over to the new community. And that's what's happened. They have aldermen. The People Center is run by a Somali woman now. the clients are Somali and Ethiopians, so it's the whole community has changed, and they have benefited from this belief that that community is theirs and not anyone else's, and they can run it, they can run the institutions, they can build new institutions that reflect their identity and not, the hippies that we were. That's long gone. But it is, it's the lifeblood of that community, and it's transformed.
I know Dean pretty well. My kids went to school with his kids. I've known him a long time. People around him. So, how long were you working on the West Bank, or our West Bank?
Let's see. I lived there. I moved there as a junior or senior in college. And then I left in 1976, 77, maybe 76-ish? No. What is it? Yeah. Late 70s. And I moved to the south side of Minneapolis, so it's not so far away. So I moved and lived in the same household with Eddie Feline and Marley Rusoff. So I didn't move too far from the West Bank. And then in 1980, I moved to New York City.
And how much of your life was community organizing during the time you were living in this area? During the 70s.
Well, I started organizing, doing community organizing on the West Bank in 68. No, when did I graduate from college? Yeah, 68. 69, probably, maybe more accurately. And that was kind of just the very, very beginnings of the formation of what became the West Bank Community Union. And I worked with Jim Belka and Ron Bell, who were two graduate students in the School of Social Work, and they had to have a project. And they came to the West Bank Student Union, which is the arm of Kaufman Union, and I was working there as a program staff. And they had an idea, and they said, we should do something on the West Bank, and kind of sponsored by the student union, University of Minnesota Student Union, and the School of Social Work. And so we just kind of thought, what can we do? And we came up, I don't know how we came, I don't know if it was Jim Belka's idea or Ron Bell's idea, to form a free clinic to serve this very marginalized community, which I lived in, of the whole hippie flower children culture was very strong on the West Bank. A lot of drugs, and it was the beginning of sexual awareness and freedom. Birth control was available to women, so that was really the instrument of freedom for women to choose. And so it was that whole, what we call now intersectionality, but it was the confluence of many issues that came together. And so we formed a free clinic, which was called the Cedar Riverside Free Clinic for a couple months. And then eventually, collectively, we formed a little board of directors of other community people. And we said, well, maybe we should do more than a free clinic, because people came in with their animals. And then Dean Zimmerman and Susie Schroer came and said, can we sell wholesale grains in the waiting room of sick people? We were selling food, unwrapped food. And we said, sure. And so we sold they sold beans and rice in big bins, and people, there was a scale, and they put their money in a jar. And that was the beginning of the co-op movement in the waiting room of the People Center. And then animals came in, and I thought, gee, we should start taking care of animals too. So I approached a family friend who was married to a vet, and he brought the veterinary school in with a number of other people, and they started a free veterinary clinic. And then we said, well, we need more than just animals and people care. We need to look at mental health issues. And so the through kind of the School of Social Work, many trained psychologists and psychiatrists of notable stature came and volunteered. And one of the leading family sociologists did some family counseling there, and we had some counseling rooms that were built, but it was always crowded. And so sometimes he held his sessions in the hallway, a couple, kids, whatever. And he said to me, importantly, we are taught to always have privacy, physical privacy, a room, closed door. But here, because this environment is safe, my clients, the patients who were coming for counseling, felt just fine sitting on the couch opposite somebody else who's also waiting or who has their dog with them. First of all, everyone is, busy in their own thoughts, but moreover, it's a safe place. And that's an incomparable experience that I can't imagine didn't affect all of us who were part of the movement in the beginning. And it spawned other community development corporations around Minneapolis. It certainly inspired Dean Zimmerman to run for city council, and it was a whole era of alternative voices, and 100 Flowers, all of those institutions that came about, that we created, that were, people can say, oh, that was those days, that's long gone. But I think the experiences, for me it was leadership training, it was an idea that was successful, that delivered what people needed from very little resources, really showed, certainly me, a very important lesson for that, I used forever.
When you began to be associated with this neighborhood in an organizing way, you were employed by the University of Minnesota.
Yes, I
Did you
was.
continue to be employed by them for a long stretch of this time?
No. I think I quit, or I don't know, left. And so as the People Center became established, I think I left the student union and worked pretty much full-time on setting up and running the People Center, but I was never paid. And my husband worked, so we lived very modestly at that time. And so sometimes he was working various jobs, I was working various jobs. So we weren't, in a sense, subsidized with a professional income that enabled. So we viewed our lives as full-time organizers. He, I think, worked for Head Start as a lifeguard one summer, and So it was piecing things together, but we never actually worked at either the co-op or the People's Center as far as salaries. Other people did. That, just was our choice.
These days I'm talking to University of Minnesota people about outreach. That word matters some. And I'm curious how you understood, as this whole thing was unfolding on the West Bank, the place of the university with respect to what was happening.
Well, I think, then, and we've learned a lot of lessons, we viewed them as the enemy. And that the university with its parking lots was encroaching on this community, and houses were being purchased and bulldozed for parking lots, so that Arlo Guthrie's song was very relevant. And so we viewed the university as the enemy, and there was an incident where, and the university eventually bought the church that we had convinced to house the People's Center. And so at first the church, which was a dying congregation, had a lot of empty space in their basement or their first floor, their gym. And so we kind of took over the whole church. And so we were subsidized by, I believe it was an Episcopalian and combination Lutheran church. So we were subsidized by the church in that regard. Eventually the church sold to the university, which we did not know. And the university then counted it as a community contribution. And we were completely unaware of this. We just thought we were still dealing with the church because the church was still there and the parish was still there. So when we had issues with the building, we talked to the pastor. And we eventually found out that the university owned the building because they wanted us to leave, because they were going to clear the whole block and build a parking lot, not just an asphalt parking lot, but an actual multi-story parking lot, which they eventually did do on the neighboring blocks. But so that's when we became aware of it, and what I did was do the first kind of real political organizing outside our community. And I had noticed one day that Marty Sabo, who was Speaker of the House at that time, had brought his dog to our veterinary clinic. And so I sat and talked to Marty Sabo and said, "Very nice to have you here." And he thought it was a wonderful enterprise. And so I called Marty Sabo and said, "Remember, your dog is number blah, blah, blah in our clinic. And I would really appreciate it if you could speak to the university." So we had a meeting with the university, and it was their community relations VP and a number of other people. There were 3 people, and they came to the People's Center, and we had 150 people there and Marty Sabo. And so we said to them, we had a whole program planned. We had medical students who were volunteers testify that it was their most important medical experience, that it would inform their practice. Marty Sabo said, "You are a chartered university, chartered by the state legislature. It's very interesting, that you are, wanting to bulldoze this institution that the university actually was subsidizing through the payment of rent for that land. We weren't paying rent, so we were getting it rent free." And so the university was furious at us, absolutely furious. And they said, "We thought we were meeting with the steering committee or the board of the People Center, this is a complete hijacking of the meeting, and I remember my closing remarks to them, which links to Dinkytown at that time, and I said, if you think the protest against the Red Barn, which is selling hamburgers, is something, you have not seen a protest. We had 300 or 400 patients who were getting care. We had medical students, we had pharmacology students, we had the Speaker of the House, we had Congressman Donald Fraser, who entered the good work of the People Center into Congress during one of his times where congressmen read things that are happening in their communities. And I said, we will organize. And they backed off, and maybe about 3 years later, I met a man who then I came to work with, who was head of the McKnight Foundation. And he came unannounced to the People Center, and he was walking around looking at it, and I said, what brings you here? And he said, the University of Minnesota has a grant from the McKnight Foundation to pay for the rent of this building. I wanted to see what it did, and they were claiming the good works of the People Center as an achievement of the University of Minnesota.
She's wonderful. But so if I'm hearing you right, there were various pieces of the university, the School of Social Work,
Yes,
the
very much.
the kind of the folks in the psychology, the kind of counseling psych people, who were in some sense, donating a lot of work to these
Right,
institutions. Then there was the kind of central
Well, and the
administration.
student union was really important.
Yeah. Okay. What was the student union's role?
Well, in the beginning, I was a staff member,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was using my time with these two graduate students. So it was kind of in the School of Social Work was on the West Bank in the new Social Science Tower 1, or I can't remember what the name of it. And so it was, part of my work to, work with students, particularly West Bank-based students, West Bank campus students. So it was individual leadership within the University of Minnesota who had common values and used the power of the university to support good work. And but I think we were very clear that the university as an institution, bigger than these individual faculty members and the head of the West Bank Student Union, were acting possibly more as individuals, as scholars, and within their sphere of influence. And eventually we did call on them, to build support. And in this protest with the university, they also tried to put pressure on General Hospital, because through one of the pharmacology students, we were given free drugs from General Hospital. And once a week I drove the People Center van, and I have no idea how we got the van, but it was this funky, hippie van that could make it to General Hospital, which was, a mile away. And I would drive into the warehouse of the hospital, and they knew who I was. And I was given permission to walk through the entire corridors of the drugs. And I had a list from the head of the medical team and the pharmacologist and the head nurse, all of whom were distinguished medical practitioners volunteering. And I had a list. And the staff of the warehouse helped me fill this. I only took the list. I never went beyond that. And I took the quantities, and they signed off, I signed off, and it was, this medical personnel doing this. And So I met with the administrator of General Hospital and I said, you cut us off and you will see all those patients in your waiting room at the same time in an organized effort to demonstrate how the General Hospital was not serving this population. We are serving it, and we appreciate, the support you're giving us, but you have a choice. And that was it. And it was really the Red Barn, this huge demonstration that friends like Bill Tilton were organizing around a hamburger shop that enabled us to, in a sense, threaten major institutions with a protest that would be much different than a hamburger protest. Though those protests in the end were about community control of development. And unfortunately, because students are not organized in the same way that tenants are, the issues could not be focused on, we want control of Dinkytown development, and we wanted to serve the interests of Dinkytown, not Dinkytown residents and the university in the same way. So it kind of had a more short-term impact, but it was very much connected to anti-war work at that same time. And one of the things that I shared when Marv Davidoff died was that he came to our house during the evening before this huge protest march against George Romney, who was on cabinet he was head of HUD at the time, and he was coming to open Cedar Towers. And there was going to be a huge anti-war protest from the university to the Capitol and downtown, just huge. And there were going to be tens of thousands of people there, and we certainly were going to join that march. So Marv Davidoff had a brilliant idea, and he said, why don't we have two themes at this march? Community control and end the war now. And so I and a number of people went up on the rooftops of houses on the West Bank. Some of the small apartment buildings had flat roofs, and we painted a slogan that was, end the war, Cedar Riverside for the people. And so it was these block letters on these rooftops. And then there were thousands of people protesting the war on the university campus and in front of the Capitol. And Romney was going to fly in from the airport to Cedar Riverside to open this, cut the ribbon. And the mayor, the police, who was the guy? The policeman, Charlie Stenvick, who was quite sympathetic to our cause, but we had never really mobilized with him. And they were in the helicopter coming in to land in Cedar Riverside Plaza. And Charlie Stenwick said to Romney, and they saw this, the banner, the paintings on the rooftops, and then they saw thousands of people, which we hadn't mobilized. The anti-war movement had mobilized. But the slogans were now two slogans: end the war, housing for people. So it was no longer just one issue. And he said to Romney, I cannot assure your safety. And the helicopter turned around and he left. And there was no ribbon cutting by the Secretary of HUD. So that was the beginning of the intersectionality of issues. That community control was also about peace building and about having a voice in policies, whether they're foreign policies or community development policies.
So if you can get a large sign connected to a large crowd, you can make things happen.
Well, I think it was a little more than that.
But it's really striking.
Because we had institutions that demonstrated that there were alternatives to how things could be done. And I think people like Jack Can certainly helped us understand that institution building, not so much for the People Center, but certainly for the formation of the Cedar Riverside Community Development Corporation. That was really key. And we saw models throughout the United States in Southside Chicago. The community banks, and people on the South Side started the community banks on the South Side and of Minneapolis, modeling the South Side Bank in Chicago, and the Restoration Community Development Corporation in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where I live on the edge there, were models of community control and community institution building, that you have to have a framework that that people can turn to for alternatives, concrete alternatives. And we utilized some experts from the housing movement nationally who came to testify. We ultimately did a environmental impact lawsuit that Miles Lord was the judge. And his opening remarks at the hearing were astounding. And he said, "I've waited all my life to defend the good guys." And I see this ragtag band of people over there. It was Steve Parliament, Jack Can, John Herman, who was the Minnesota MPERG, Public Interest Group. It was the beginning of the, Ralph Nader's environmental movement. So there was John Herman, an environmental lawyer. There was us, and literally the ragtag band with our cardboard file cases. And then there were the Heller Siegel Corporation lawyers with their beautiful suits and briefcase. And Miles Lord looked and said, "This is going to be very interesting." And he ruled, of course, in our favor after many, many months of testimony. And we brought in experts from all over the country who were architects, who were urban planners, who said that we have examples around the world of lower density and of community control that can work, that can meet community needs. And those experts helped us tell the story and provide an alternative. And there are alternative townhouses. We got Hoffman Electric, one of the biggest electrical contracting companies in Minneapolis, to look at how we could have alternatives. And they subsequently, they're second generation owners of that firm, built the first solar housing on the West Bank by Hoffman Electric. So they continue to do regular electric, but they also saw this as an example to grow their enterprise where private sector could invest on the right side. And they did it they came from a faith base. They came because they were good Episcopalians, and they were influenced by Reverend Bill Teska, who was an Episcopalian priest on the West Bank, and they were influenced by that and that faith-driven message. And so it was really a lot of different people coming from different angles. And I think one of my regrets, especially when we now know much more about protests and who the enemy is, we thought the university was our enemy, and we thought even architects who were working for the university or other institutions were personally our enemies. And I think, with maturity, you learn that they represent institutions, and in fact, they can be allies, and we can maybe work to change those institutions. And I think gradually That happened at the University of Minnesota to some degree, though. I think there's always work to be done.
So, I'm curious, what did you learn about yourself in this process? I mean, it's always a collective that's doing
Yeah.
everything, but I guess I'm curious as to what strengths you discovered, what roles you fell into.
No, I learned to
Over
talk in
this
front of an
time.
audience.
Yeah.
That piece of leadership. And I think I learned slowly and very, I think, compassionately, that you don't make friends if you're a leader. And that there is an element of, and it didn't happen then on the West Bank, that was not true. But I could see that when you took positions, you created not enemies in our context, but people who disagreed with you. And we had 100 flowers of styles. And, everybody has a personality style. And so, you learn that tolerance. But I think I kind of, I think, bridged that other of the marginalized community on the West Bank. And I started, and I think Parliament, we were kind of put in a role of bridging the marginalized community, the people who were maybe more pure or conceptually more consistent. I think we had a less, we were able, in the language of that time, we were able to traffic across communities. And so our community, so I felt that we could serve our community in that way. If we brought that message authentically. And so that authenticity, I think, is really important, and that's true for politicians as well, as we know that an authentic politician is a very powerful one, and only the people know if they're authentic or not. The leadership part, as I built a professional career, you have immense influence, you have immense power, and so it comes with a responsibility, and it's not a popularity contest. That is what I think I learned on the West Bank, that it wasn't necessarily because we were the most popular people. But maybe we were likable, but that's not why we were doing it. We weren't doing it because we wanted votes, or we believed in it. We believed in the cause. We believed in our community. We believed in, all of this ragtag band, and that is important. But as the institutions get bigger, more formalized, the responsibility becomes greater. Leaders are not popular, and anybody who has leadership positions knows that it can be lonely as well. And now today in the women's movement, there is a very big movement for self-care. What does it mean to take care of your leaders? Protect them and nurture them so that they can continue to be authentic and not drop out, not burn out, and be comforted by the same community as that community movement places greater and greater demands on them. And I saw that in the Women's March. The women who started the Women's March were not, they had been leaders, but they were not as big leaders as they are today. And they live in the community that I live in today, and they are they have guards, they have security forces around them, always. And that's the price in today's world that they pay for thinking this idea and putting it up on Facebook. She has to have security around her now. So I guess when you have a good message that is revolutionary, you do create real enemies.
I have hanging around the same place over about the same period, but without the courage or involvement that you had, have stumbled into pockets of purity of all different sorts in that in those neighborhoods, from places where the works of Stalin are seriously discussed to people who are simply old-timey anarchists who will never tell you what they do on weekends. All sorts of things. Very pure people, very admirable people who, nevertheless, I'm not going to join. And to be the public face or the spokesperson for those folks, while always being a little suspect on the matter of purity, must have been quite a challenge.
We're very young and passionate, so I don't think it was a challenge then at all. I think it was a gift that we built together with everyone. I didn't feel it then. I think I definitely feel it now in professional life, when you're the boss or, you meet with governments and et cetera. So it's the institutionalization of it is different. But then I didn't feel that. So I guess I don't want to mix it up in that's what I learned about leadership. At the time, I didn't feel it. But in, 50 years, hindsight in 50 years of being in leadership positions, my conclusion would be that it is, it's not a popularity contest. But at that time, those 10 years, I think Steve and I did full-time organizing for about 7 years. And we had a friend of his stay overnight once, and he said, "I'm never doing this ever again." Because he said, "This is Grand Central Station. This, I can't sleep on the couch." I mean, there weren't necessarily people coming in, but the phone was ringing constantly. And people were knocking on the door, maybe, to drop off organic vegetables more often than not. But it was not a private home. And so I think Steve and I sacrificed that, but I don't think we knew we were sacrificing it. We loved it. It was a very special moment for all of us that time. I think it was incomparable today to live and breathe a community like that, not just to go to meetings and organize and then go on a march and have communications by social media. We lived a lifestyle of collectivity that had to do with good food and good music and good politics. So it was all those things in good faith for those who were following a faith-based path. And it was tolerated. We embraced everybody's approach, and I'm not so sure we're so tolerant today.
So what was your transition like from this life as an organizer to kind of the career that followed?
Well, it was rapid. I lived in the household of Eddie Fellini and Marley Rusoff, and I applied for a job. I had to, earn money. So I applied for a job at the Otto Bremer Foundation. And it was a small foundation at that time with only 2 staff. And they took a risk because my background was very transparent. And so I started on this path of grant making. And they taught me a lot about grant making and doing good works. Even though it was very small at that time, it still did very good work of bankers, a foundation that owned the bank, which is very unique. And from that philanthropic work, profession actually, I was recruited by the Ms. Foundation for Women in New York, and I went to work for them. I eventually became the executive director there. And so then I became a philanthropic professional. And at a certain time I realized that I wanted to do international work. And through a Minnesota colleague who worked at the UN, who was an organizer in South Minneapolis, he had a job in the UN and he hired me. And I helped organize one of the women's conferences in 1985, the Nairobi Women's Conference. I organized what they call the non-governmental side. And that was the beginning of my UN career, which started with the Minnesota Connection, organizing women. And so it all comes back to the West Bank.
How much tension did you feel between the kind of work you were doing enmeshed in the community and the work as in philanthropy and then later in the United Nations?
Well, I left philanthropy because I was in New York City, so this is really big philanthropy. Even though I was with a cohort that considered themselves the funders of progressive causes. And we were a little working group. And it eventually became what's called Philanthropy New York. But so we were funding progressive causes, funded by the second and third generation of the robber barons. Much of the money came from those sources, and or from banking or things like that, and or from the Ms. Foundation came from individual donations. So I left that profession because I felt that my own authenticity was getting further and further away. Even though I worked very closely with the women's movement, I was always seen as a donor. I was the Ms. Foundation. We were funding the first of everything, the first shelter, the first abortion clinic, coalition of advocacy on abortion. We funded Catholics for Choice. All of these things were the first kitchen group of 3 women who wanted to do a shelter. Literally from their kitchen. So this was the funding of the Ms. Foundation, as it still is today. And so I was not seen as a sister. I was seen as a sister who had access to money. And I began to feel that I wasn't rich. I came from a more or less middle class background. And I didn't like that. I began to feel separated, and I didn't like that. So I left the philanthropic community for that reason and wanted to do international work. And eventually, though, I was hired by the philanthropic arm of the United Nations, which is the largest donor agency in the world. So it has I had skills that I continued to build on, but it's a little different. So all the dots do connect, but I had I don't have any regrets on having those skills that I learned on the West Bank.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for connecting all those dots. And I wonder, Joyce, if you'd say something sort of full circle about your choice about your final resting place. That's pretty
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. Well, I shared with Nora earlier that I've decided to be cremated, which is not so revolutionary. And then one wonders, well, what do you do with it? Well, in Chinese, Japanese, Asian cultures, frequently the family members keep the urn or place it in a family hall or family resting place. So I've decided that my ashes will be strewn on St. Anthony Falls, which is now very developed. And the reason for that, even though I haven't lived in Minnesota, I've lived in New York City and abroad more than I lived my adult life in Minnesota, because my father and I used to go for walks in southeast Minneapolis where I grew up. And the park board had these undeveloped lands, and so we would walk through these paths. And one of the paths led to the tip of St. Anthony Falls. And there was a little plaque for the friar. I don't know if it was St. Nicolene or whomever it was. And it was just a very magical moment with my father. And it was very much my love of Minneapolis. So that's my resting place. I didn't want to be thrown over the whatever it is, that campus bridge, the West Bank.
Yeah.
That didn't seem romantic enough. So those are my choices. I think the Mill City Basin or whatever that's called now was far more beautiful. And yeah, it's my Minneapolis story.
Have you found a community with the kind of excitement that you had on the West Bank, now? Have you gotten back to that?
I'm retired now, and I live in the heart of gentrification in New York City. I live in Brooklyn, and I live at Ground Zero. My husband and I, Ed Lai, bought our brownstone, a historic brownstone. It's landmarked in an Afro-Caribbean neighborhood in the early 90s, 93. The houses around us were boarded up, graffitied and vandalized. The house we bought was not vandalized, but it was semi-occupied. And to give you a flavor of the immediate neighborhood, the houses next door, on the headlines of the New York Times in 1994, they named the 5 most notorious crack houses in New York City. And at that time, I and my family were living abroad for the United Nations. And a neighbor told me about this article and the story that she had, which is very interesting. She's reading it, and they give the addresses of these houses and the little balloon dots, the pin dots. And her daughter, who is college age, and they're talking about it, and my friend neighbor says, "Wow, that address is really close to us." And her daughter said, "That's Freddie next door, Mom." So that was 2 doors down from me. That house is now being sold for $3.1 million. So our neighborhood has organized very unsuccessfully against some of the major gentrification, clearance housing, tearing down brownstones, etc., as well, before we were there or during the time we were gone and living abroad.